So I'd like to kick off this YouTube presentation actually by showing two primary documents. So obviously Professor Hall's text is a secondary document, a secondary source. It's Professor Hall's interpretation. But he obviously brings to the surface in his historical analysis, his 500 years of history which he brings to light, a plethora and a myriad of primary documents. And so I'd like to bring two kind of conflicting and contrasting primary documents to the attention of YouTube viewers, which I think have profound implications and which come up again and again throughout Professor Hall's text. And so the first one I'm going to bring up is entitled The Royal Proclamation of 1763. It's a very important document in the history of especially North America, especially Canada and the United States. The document is certainly of interest to those who seek a deeper understanding for the motivations of the people who rose up against the British imperial authority, the duly constituted authority of the British Empire, and founded this polity which today is called the United States of America. Now, the Royal Proclamation emanated from the office of King George III. So he was the king of Britain at the time, and so he was kind of ruler of British North America. Obviously, when you're running a formal empire like the British Empire was, one with colonial structures, with an acknowledgement that one is taking part in a colonial enterprise, you have to engage in voluminous negotiations and deliberations with the people whom you encounter and who you rule over, who are subjects of your empire. And therefore, the Royal Proclamation, I think, is particularly interesting because it's expressing King George III's attempt to create some kind of equilibrium in British North America at the time. So here we have the Royal Proclamation, October 7th, 1763. It was penned by King George III, the monarch of Great Britain at the time. And so I'm not going to take up the viewer's time by deconstructing each and every tenet of this document. Anybody who's interested can Google that, but you can see it's kind of it's a legal document. Firstly, secondly, thirdly, fourthly, and so on. But I'd like to just sort of hone in on one particular aspect of this document, which provides a very deep insight into the agenda of the British imperial authorities vis-a-vis the indigenous people of North America. And of course, today, if you think there's a country called India that's ruled by Indian people, East Indian people, there's a country called Kenya which is ruled by Kenyan people, but yet the country of where say the Cherokee lived, the Anishinaabe lived, the Blackfoot lived, they don't have a state in the United Nations, do they? Whereas the Kenyans do have a state. Admittedly, they have tribes and so on within that polity that aren't represented in the United Nations. But certainly, if we want to understand why the power structures were dominated, I'm just going to recite some of this and then sort of discuss its implications for an understanding of the establishment of the polity called the United States, the establishment of the polity called Canada, and to provide a deeper understanding of the indigenous question and the deliberations which took place vis-a-vis the indigenous people of North America during this epoch. And so here the document, which is officially the utterances of King George III, states the following: "And whereas the great frauds and abuses have been committed in purchasing the lands of the Indians, to the great prejudice of our interests, and to the great dissatisfaction of the said Indians, in order therefore to prevent such irregularities for the future, and to end that the Indians may be convinced of our justice and determined resolution to remove all reasonable cause of discontent, we do advise with our privy council strictly enjoin and require that no private person do presume to make any purchase of the said Indian lands or of any lands reserved for the said Indians within those parts of our colonies where we have thought proper to allow settlement." So what he's actually saying is that when private individuals go forth and negotiate things locally with indigenous people, and of course when you have wealth and power and prestige and influence, you can often corrupt people and manipulate people. Here we have a kind of top-down decree that that's not going to happen anymore. And so that's the main crux of this. I'll just adumbrate the last part of this, which is also interesting. If at any time any of the said Indians should be inclined to dispose of the said lands, the same shall be purchased only for us, in our name, at some public meeting or assembly of the said Indians, to be held for that purpose by the governor or commander-in-chief of our colony, respectively, within which they shall lie, and in case they shall lie, within the limits of any proprietary government. And so, what's kind of amazing about this text is it's not the kind of ruthless and rapacious dictatorship that one might expect inherent to a colonial imperialist project. It's actually acknowledging that the Indian people, the Native Americans, the people who have land title there, the people who've been living there for hundreds of thousands of years, do indeed have that land title and do indeed have some expression of sovereignty which needs to be at least taken account of and acknowledged. And so what's quite revolutionary, you might say, ironically revolutionary coming from a king in this text, is the fact that King George is actually acknowledging Indian title and Indian entitlement to land. And so what makes this text historically significant is the fact that in dictating the terms of westward expansion, King George III is in fact acknowledging the indigenous peoples of that polity as having inherent, inalienable rights to land title and to be negotiated with rather than to be ethnically cleansed, displaced and so on. So he's, at some public meeting or assembly of the said Indians. So it's very civilized. It's very, it's saying, okay, we're undertaking a colonial project and we're going to negotiate with the people who live here. And of course, you have to remember that King George was interested in perpetuating the mercantilist system rather than a free trade system. So mercantilism being, you don't really want your colonies to industrialize and to modernize. You just want to use the colonies for kind of raw resources, which you then put into the mother country's industrialization process. So you want furs from North America, you want wood, you want certain raw resources, but you don't really have a vested interest in your colonies, whether it was Fiji or India or elsewhere, or Ireland, industrializing. And so really the concept of the 13 colonies staying near the coast, which happened in South Africa, which happened elsewhere, was the agenda which King George wanted. And so he didn't really want the kind of frontierman, the westward expansion that we see in the kind of Wild West movies, which became symbolic of the United States agenda. And so that's the Royal Proclamation of 1763. So the second primary document I'd like to bring to the attention of the viewer is the Declaration of Independence, which was enshrined on July 4th, 1776, Independence Day. I would say the Declaration of Independence has to some extent been misconceived. It's been represented often as a progressive act. The American Revolution, I think, in many people's minds is synonymous with the Enlightenment principles of equality, of progress, of a reaction against the kind of superstition and undemocratic principles of British colonialism and of the monarchical system and of mercantilism. And, it's, I think, been portrayed especially by in Hollywood as a kind of, progressive occurrence, historical occurrence. And so we see, this in the United States, this kind of exceptionalism that we see, this kind of quite curious patriotism, like very overzealous patriotism, and this constant invocation of the founding fathers, our founding fathers, and I think in the psychology of both citizens of the United States and many outside the United States, it's got this the founding myths of the United States are really encapsulated in many people's minds in this document. So we look at the Declaration of Independence. We see the tenet of this document, which we've heard so many times. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal,